Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last lesson, we learned from a high level what it is these security rules are trying to do. In this lesson, we're actually going to tackle writing our first security rule. And the first thing we're going to write it for is the users collection that we have. So let's just quickly take a quick step back and understand the moving parts inside of our user flow from the get-go. Because we're going to actually retouch upon a lot of topics that we touched over before, but in the context of security rules. Let's just go back to our application for a quick second and look at our get snapshot from user auth method. This was inside of our Saga, and as we remember what happens whenever a user actually signs in, we get some user auth object that we then use to call our create user profile document method inside of our Firebase utils. If we were to just quickly console log this user auth object, we will remember that what this user auth object has is actually a little bit different from what it is that we're storing. This auth object has all of these properties on it, because this auth object comes from the actual authentication section of our Firebase. This authentication happens through our Google provider or through our email and password. But in the case of our actual application, we take this user auth object and we use it to create a new user profile document. We might pass in the email and we pass in the UID, which, as you remember, is the ID that automatically gets assigned to every authenticated user inside of our application. We use those properties to actually build out our user profile document, which is inside of our database, inside of our users collection. And why this is important is because we're actually going to need this UID as well inside of our security rules. And right now it might seem confusing, but I promise you that it will make sense once we start writing it. Just remember that there is this auth object, which is different from the actual user document that we have stored. So let's actually explore how these two things come together inside of the security rule that we're going to write for our users collection. Inside of our users collection, let's first delete this part of our match statement and keep the service line as well as the first match database line, and make a new match statement for our users / and then here is going to be a wildcard that we write inside of these parentheses. So this /users points to our users collection. This / and then the parentheses here, we are actually saying we want to target all of the documents. The reason we do this is because we sometimes need access to the actual object that is being stored. For example, if we wanted to make sure or do something with the name, we can access the name or the email, for example, on this user object that we have stored. We can actually access it by saying here user.data.email or user.data.displayname. This .data property allows us to access the different attributes on this user document reference object. In our case, however, we want the ID. The ID in our case is not stored on the data. It's actually what's used to reference the data object here. This is the ID, but it's not actually a field on this object. So what we need to do in order to access it is leverage one of the available wildcards we have inside of security rules. So what are wildcards? Wildcards are kind of like these methods that Firebase gives us access to inside of these security rules that allow us to fetch specific things. So in this case, this user object here, we saw how we could get different properties off of the specific document object model that we're using. In this case, we only want the ID. So we can use the wildcard ID like this, which lets us access the identifier of this document reference object. If this was, say, collections, you would do the same thing by saying collection ID. Just by writing the syntax, Firebase understands that what you want to access is the ID itself. So by doing this, we now have access to the ID that we can use inside of our actual rule. We've so far only seen us do hard allows like this. If I were to say allow read, I'm saying that anyone can read all of the things related to our user's collection. But we actually in production don't want this. We only want the user to be able to read their own user object. We don't want them to be able to read other people's user objects. We also definitely don't want them to write and overwrite other people's user objects. So this allows us to actually do so. And we do this through a conditional. Conditionals inside of Firestore security rules look very similar to conditional inside of JavaScript. It's also an if statement. The way that we write it though is a little different. First we're going to say is allow read, so what we want them to be allowed to do. And then we put this colon. After this colon, we'll put if, and then here is the actual condition itself. So every single request that gets made to update, to get, to read, to delete, whatever, this all actually gets encapsulated inside of a keyword in the security rules called request. This request keyword is essentially an object that represents the request coming in. So what we're saying is that we want to allow read if the request coming in has been authenticated. If the request coming in to get a user document object is not authenticated, we definitely don't want to give them the user object, because then nobody inside of the application, if they're on our web app or if they download our code and they're trying to access our user objects but they're not authenticated, why would we ever want to give them any of our user data? We definitely wouldn't. So we want to say that if request.auth does not equal null, remember here, we're allowing read only if request is authenticated in the first place. So if the request.auth is not null, then we also want to make sure that the user that is authenticated is only able to get their own user document object inside of our database. So here we're saying we're allowing the read if the request.auth is not null. This auth happens to be an object that has on it the UID. And this auth object looks very similar to the one that we explored earlier in the course when I console logged it out from our saga. So what we're going to say here is that the request.auth.uid must also equal the user ID of the user object that they're trying to get in the first place. So what this rule is saying is that I'm allowing read if request.auth is not null, so they're authenticated in the first place, and the UID of the authenticated user matches the user document object that they're trying to get. So this is pretty much the only user rule that we want to write for allowing them to read. In order for us to actually test this, we don't have to publish this code yet. We can test this using the simulator. The simulator allows us to actually run against our security rules here before we publish them, because sometimes in production, our code already depends on the existing rules of our database. We don't want to screw anything up and ruin the experience for our users that are currently using our application. So we test them inside of this simulator. So you click this tab for simulator here, and here you're able to simulate different types of requests. The one that we're testing, of course, is get, because we're trying to test our read rule. So here we want to say that I want to test get against our user document, and the document I'm trying to get is this one. So let's just copy this over, and this is the ID of the user object I'm trying to get. Now, this authenticated tab is turned off, meaning that we're doing a unauthenticated request. So if we run this, we'll see that the simulator read was denied because the request is not authenticated. So far that's working. Next, let's test if we actually are authenticated. And what we want to authenticate is, let's say, our custom authentication. And we want to pass in the UID, which is the one that we already just copied, meaning that we're trying to access it with the UID matching the user ID. If we run here, we see that it's allowed. This is successful because our user ID matches the UID that I just passed inside of this object here. Now let's say this was a little different. Let's cut this out so that it doesn't match. If we run again, we'll see that it's denied So this means that our user rule is working. Only users that are requesting a user object that is their own, meaning the UID matches the user ID, will be able to access their own user object. And with this, we have written our first security rule. It's a little bit weird syntax-wise, I know, to get used to, and the simulator will take some playing around with to get fully familiar with all of its features. But this is really all these security rules are based off of. It's pretty much just these conditions based on certain keywords you have to get used to that are accessible inside of the security rules. That's really all it is. And we're going to definitely write more. This is just the first introduction to our very first security rule. But just like that, we've just written our first one. So let's keep going and let's tackle the rules for creating as well as our collection. We'll do that in the subsequent lessons. So I'll see you in the next lesson.